Welcome to Maddie's Insight. Each of our Maddie's Insight webcasts contains highlights of research results and actionable recommendations based on those results, so translating research into real life. I am Dr. Sheila Segerson, a veterinary behaviorist and the Director of Community Solutions at Maddie's Fund.
And I'm Kelly Dewar. I'm Senior Community Solutions Specialist for Maddie's Fund as well.
Today, we'll be learning about short-term foster programs for shelter cats, beneficial or problematic. Our speaker today is Dr. Kristyn Vitale, who received a PhD in animal science from Oregon State University and a master's in environmental science from Miami University. Her areas of specialization are animal behavior and human-animal interaction. Her research focuses specifically on domestic cat behavior, cat social cognition, and the cat-human relationship. She has worked professionally with cats for over 15 years, teaching a variety of courses on animal behavior and welfare, and also a cat trainer who has taught kitten training classes and offered socialization opportunities to cats of all ages. Welcome, Kristyn. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'll just jump right into it. So we know that there's over 600 million cats living among humans worldwide, and around 94 million of those live in US homes alone. Around 3.4 million cats enter US shelters every year. So it's obvious that cats play a huge role in the lives of humans, whether they live on the streets, in our homes, or they're cared for in animal shelters. Despite the ubiquity of cats, there's been relatively little scientific research that's been conducted with them. This is especially true when looking at their social behavior or their interactions with people. And some of this might come down to this idea that, well, why should we study the social behavior of a solitary animal? So that brings us to the first question. Are cats solitary or are they social animals? Well, cats are what's known as facultatively social. That means that they can live both socially or solitarily. They display flexible social behavior that's really dependent on their environment and their upbringing. So for example, you can see some cats below that I worked with for my master's. The cats on the right are a colony that I studied. And what we see is that this social living in free-roaming cats often occurs in areas of clumped resources. So when food, shelter, and mates are all in one location. We'll see solitary living when prey is more dispersed. So cats do display social behavior, and within these colonies, when they do form, they form social relationships and engage in an array of social behavior. And we can see that here. Here are some of the cats from the colony I studied engaging in an array of social behavior. Not only do they naturally engage in social behavior with one another, they also engage in social behavior with humans. So if cats engage in social behavior and social behavior is an important part of their lives, then what is going on with this perception that cats are aloof or solitary all of the time? Well, this idea of expectancy bias is something that could be shaping this. So expectancy bias is when beliefs that we have unintentionally, when our beliefs impact how we treat the cat, which then impacts that cat's behavior. So for example, if we think that social behavior is not important, or we think cats don't do well with socialization or experiences in novel places, then we're going to give them fewer opportunities to socialize with strangers, to socialize with unfamiliar cats, or to travel to these novel locations to actually get pleasant experiences. Because so often the only time cats leave the home is to go to the vet, and those experiences are not always pleasant. So here's one example about how what we believe about cats may impact how we treat them, which then impacts the cat's sociability. And expectancy bias can also impact cat care practices. So something that I've heard a lot is that cats should not be sent out to foster because fostering produces unnecessary stress for the cat. But is this actually supported by science? Well, what we do know is that shelter life has been associated with increased levels of stress for both dogs and cats. And within shelters, social isolation can be a major stressor for these animals. Now, with dogs, dog fostering is pretty commonplace, and it's often perceived as positive for the dog's welfare. In research that's been done with dog foster programs, we see that being placed into a foster program can decrease stress as leveled by urinary cortisol compared to those dogs that have stayed in the shelter. And this was true even for short foster stays of just 1 to 2 days. Now, cat foster programs are much less common, especially for healthy adult cats. Yet there is research that indicates that there's possible benefits to engaging in foster programs. So first is the benefit of just experiencing social interaction with a person. As mentioned, social isolation is a major stressor. And we also know that cats within the shelter seek out social interactions from people, that human contact can significantly reduce cat stress, and that actually in a preference test, the majority of shelter cats preferred human interaction to other forms of reward, such as food, toys, or scent objects. So it's obvious that being able to interact with humans is a major part of a consideration for shelter cats. Other benefits of fostering cats where these programs do exist indicate that they can be associated with reduced euthanasia rates in shelters, as well as the opportunity to engage in training, which can be associated with improved behavioral outcomes for those cats. So the aim of the study was to evaluate the social, behavioral, and stress outcomes associated with placing shelter cats in a short-term foster environment when compared to cats that stayed in the shelter. So our short-term foster program consisted of cats that went out for an overnight program. So this was just 1 day long, 24 hours, where the cats left the shelter and then came back. And then some cats also left for 1 week to stay at the foster before they returned. We also had a group of cats that stayed in the shelter, so they never left to go to foster. For some of these cats, they served as our control group, so nothing outside of normal routine husbandry happened to these cats. We also had a group of cats that participated in a socialization program where they received 45 minutes of socialization outside of the cage with a set partner. But I don't have time to talk about that today because we're just mainly focused on the fostering aspect. But I did want to mention that this group does exist. And when I talk about the in-shelter group, that is combining both the control and the socialization program because we did not find significant differences between them. Our research was conducted at 2 study sites in Oregon. Both shelters were no-kill limited admission shelters. And we enrolled 80 cats into the program, 40 foster and 40 in-shelter cats. Now, with that said, not all of those 80 cats that were enrolled continued through the duration of the study. Some cats dropped out because they were adopted or because there was a medical issue. And so the sample size really does vary by test. So if you're interested in the full results along with the sample sizes for each test, please see our published paper. Additionally, we only enrolled adult cats because we're mainly interested in the impact to adult healthy individuals. And so we only enrolled cats that were above 1 year old. We collected 2 main points of data. These included our stress measure, which was urinary cortisol. And we know that urine samples reflect stress levels about 1 to 3 hours prior to urination. So they're a pretty good measure of short-term stress for the individual. We used Kit for Cat hydrophobic sand, and we placed this in a disposable clean litter box. And what happens is the sand repels the urine and then allows you to then just take a pipette, suck the urine up, and place it into a test tube, as you can see on the right. We also calculated a cortisol creatinine ratio, and we did this to standardize the cortisol level, because as you can see on the right, even with an individual's urine, the dilution of it might depend on the day, how much water they've had. So creating this ratio allowed us to standardize each of those samples. We also collected behavioral data. So we conducted the felinality assessment, which I'm sure many of you in the rescue world are familiar with the felinality. And as part of that assessment, there's one aspect of it where you take the cat out of their cage, bring them into a novel room. And for that part of the assessment, we also measured how much time the cat spent near to the person. So you can see that here in this photo below. There's tape on the ground. And when the cat is within that circle, we know that they're within proximity to the person. So that counts. So basically, we would just count how much time do they spend, 75% of the minute, 0%. It's one way to measure sociability. We collected both urine and behavioral data at 3 time points. And we always collected the urine before the behavioral data because we didn't want the felinality assessment to potentially impact that cortisol level. So all cats received testing at baseline. This occurred 1 day before the foster cats were sent out to the foster home. All of the cats underwent the baseline time points in the shelter. And in order to continue into the study, all cats had to urinate in that litter box with the special litter in order to continue on. We then had the foster intervention for cats in the foster group, where they went out to the foster home. For cats in the in-shelter group, they stayed in the shelter. And then we took our second time point that first day of the intervention, the first day that the cat was at foster. So for the foster group, this second time point was conducted in the foster home. And for the shelter group, it was again conducted in the shelter because they hadn't left. And then finally, our third time point was 1 day after the fostering intervention was over. So this is when the cats have now returned to the shelter. And for all of the cats, this was conducted in the shelter. So neither of our shelters had a fostering program in place prior to the study. So it was something that we had to arrange. And we solicited volunteers from our local community, from the local shelter, and from our university. And we set it up so these volunteers would pick up and drop off the foster cats at set times. And when they picked up the foster cat, they received a bag of supplies. These included instructions about how to conduct the felinality, a paper copy of the felinality, a survey to track activities in the foster home, instructions and supplies for urine collection, and then extra food and a litter box with clay litter to replace the litter box after the foster had collected the urine sample. Okay, so here's a video showing the felinality. Here, it's just several short clips, but you can see this is what the in-cage assessment looks like. Here's us bringing this cat out of the room and seeing how much time they spend next to that person in that circle. And then we go through each other phase of the felinality. So that includes petting, playing, hug, sensitivity, and you can see each of those brief phases here. And we did score the felinality as we went. So you can see that I'm writing on the felinality sheet as we go. Here we have stroking the cat, playing with the cat, here's a hug, but it kind of goes out of frame. And then here's that sensitivity where I just slightly pull on the tail and see how the cat reacts. Now, we did have some cats who were unable to participate in that full felinality assessment. And in order to avoid unnecessary stress for cats, if we had an individual who displayed more than one of these behavioral indicators, we classified them as aggressive or fearful for that time point. So the behavioral indicators included dilated pupils, excessive lip licking, flattened ears, crouched body posture, hissing or growling, swatting, scratching, or biting. And here's a video. There is noise, so hopefully you'll be able to hear the vocalizations. But here in this cat, you can see frequent lip licking and swallowing, dilated pupils, distress vocalizations, which were not a criteria, but I think all of us who work with cats can hear this cat is distressed. And this cat was a Scottish fold, so the ears being flat are not a reliable indicator here. But this is an example of a cat that this session was then ended and the cat replaced back into their cage to avoid unnecessary stress. Okay, so I'm only going to present some of our results from the study, and I want you to be able to read the full study if you would like. So hopefully in the chat, they'll share a link to the full text of the paper so you can read all of the results and statistical information, because this is just a selection of it. So in terms of the volunteers, we had 15 volunteers who were recruited and hosted foster cats. 7 volunteers took more than 1 foster cat, and 1 volunteer actually took 8 foster cats. We also didn't instruct volunteers how to give access to the cats in the home. We left that up to them. So they offered different access options for the foster cats. Those included partial access, confined access, and full access. And you can see the breakdown in the pie chart below. We also asked the volunteers to report what the most frequent activities they engaged in with their foster cat, and this was free response. And the most frequently reported activity was playing with the cat at 20 responses. Petting and cuddling, snuggling were also commonly reported. On average, for volunteers who took a cat for 1 day, they reported spending about 7.6 hours with that cat. And for volunteers who took cats for 1 week, they spent about 18 hours with the cat. Okay, so what did we find? Well, again, our stress measure was our cortisol level as obtained from the urine. And again, we calculated that ratio in order to standardize it. So UCCR is just our cortisol measure. And what we found was that comparing cats that went to foster to cats that stayed in the shelter, there was no significant difference in that cortisol score between those cats at any time point. So if we were to assume that foster cats were more stressed going to foster, we would expect that during or after the intervention, they would have had higher cortisol scores than cats in the shelter, but that's not what we found. We also looked at whether this cortisol score increased or decreased from baseline to during and after the intervention. So here you can see if we expect the foster cat to be more stressed during the foster experience or after, then we would expect an increase in that cortisol score from that baseline. But again, when we compared the number of these cats that increased or decreased at each time point, we didn't see any difference between the foster and in-shelter groups. Now, when looking at the foster group only, if we combine all the fosters together, so cats that went to 1 day and 7-day foster, we again saw no significant difference in cortisol scores when comparing them at baseline to during the intervention, as well as comparing baseline to after the intervention. And then if we break it down by foster group, comparing cats that went to 1 day foster to 7-day foster, again, we found no significant difference in the number of cats that had an increase or decrease in that cortisol score from baseline to during the foster experience or after. And again, if we expect that cats only going out to foster for 1 day would be more stressed, then we would have expected more cats to have an increase in cortisol over that time, but we did not see that. Now, something unexpected that we did find was that several foster cats were not urinating in the litter box on the first day of foster. So what we saw is that compared to cats that stayed in the shelter at that second time point, significantly fewer foster cats urinated in the litter box on that first day of intervention. So if we look at this top table, we see that at that second time point, which was at the foster for the foster cats, that 19 fosters urinated in the litter box, but 10 did not. Compared to the in-shelter group, where 29 urinated in the litter box, but only 3 did not. This was a significant difference, with more foster cats refusing to urinate in the litter box at that time point. However, when comparing fosters to in-shelter cats following the intervention, so after the foster cats have returned to the shelter, we do not see significant difference between foster and in-shelter groups. All foster cats urinated in the litter box after returning from foster. In terms of fear or aggression, we looked at the number of cats labeled in this category. And what we again found that for the foster group, there was no significant difference in the number of cats labeled as aggressive or fearful from that baseline measure to when they were at the foster and from baseline to returning to the shelter. Again, if we would expect that the fostering experience would cause increased aggression or fear, then we would think more cats would be categorized as this after returning to the shelter or while at the foster. And also when comparing these foster cats to cats in the shelter, again, there was no significant difference in the number of aggressive or fearful cats at any time point. Again, showing us that foster cats were not more likely to be aggressive or fearful during the foster experience or after as compared to the shelter cats. We also looked at the social score on the felinality test. So if you're familiar with the felinality, you can see it depicted here in the bottom right. The social score is the number on the very top there. You can see it circled. So for this cat, that would have been 27, would have been their social score. So again, we looked at, did that social score increase or decrease? So if we think that maybe going to foster would decrease the social behavior of cats, then we should see a decrease for shelter groups for foster groups compared to shelter groups. But that's not what we found. When comparing foster and in shelter groups, we found no significant difference in the number of cats that had an increase or decrease in their social score from baseline to during the fostering and from baseline to after the fostering experience. Additionally, comparing 1-day fosters to 7-day fosters, the fosters that were sent out for 1 day did not show less social behavior during or after fostering. Again, we saw no significant difference in the number of cats with an increase or decrease in social score from baseline to during and from baseline to after the experience. And then finally, with that novel room sociability test, or the time spent next to the stranger for the first minute, we found that foster cats did not display significantly less social behavior after returning from foster. So when we compared between foster and in shelter groups, there was no significant difference between these groups at either baseline or when the cats had returned from the shelter, from foster. So again, if we had expected that foster cats may be stressed from the fostering experience and may show less social behavior upon return, then we should see less time spent with that stranger in this phase, but we did not see that. Okay, so that was a lot of results. So what in all does that mean? Well, our results indicate that shelter cats placed in foster care were not at a disadvantage compared to cats that stayed in the shelter. So we saw that foster cats did not have significantly higher cortisol scores. They did not display significantly less social behavior after fostering. They were not more likely to display signs of fear or aggression. And we also found that both 24-hour fostering and 1-week fostering seem to be viable options for shelter cats. There was no significant difference in stress levels for 1-day fosters and 7-day fosters, and fosters sent out only for 24 hours did not show less social behavior during or after fostering. So is fostering too stressful for cats? Well, we did mention that there were several cats that did not urinate during the first night of foster. This might indicate that lack of urination could be a behavioral marker for stress. But even with this, the effect is not long lasting when it occurs. We found that after returning to the shelter, foster cats resumed using the litter box. And for the cats that were sent out for 1 week, who also did not urinate on the first night, none were reported to have issues urinating in the box on day 2 of foster. Now with this, although foster cats were not at a disadvantage, we also found short-term fostering didn't lead to a significant increase in human-directed social behavior or improvement in stress level. So future research does need to be conducted in order to find significant factors that could impact significant differences in cat welfare. We could look at fostering lengths greater than 1 week, fostering practices such as different access to the home, traits of the individual cats, whether some individuals benefit from fostering more than others. But with all of this considered, is fostering still worth it? Well, I say yes. I say there are many benefits to establishing adult cat foster programs for your shelter. The first is the opportunity for human social interaction that has the potential to promote cat welfare. So we know, as I've already discussed, that providing opportunities for social interaction is extremely beneficial for shelter cats. This allows them the chance to engage in social interactions with a set person and receive individualized attention. Now, as mentioned, some cats may experience stress due to that change in the environment. Yet even with this, cats in the foster home still freely participated in social interactions and were equally likely to be highly social, both at the shelter and at foster. And foster volunteers reported engaging in many social interactions with their cats, such as playing, petting, cuddling, and snuggling. And here you can see some photos from some of the cats we sent out to foster. Another benefit for your shelter of establishing an adult cat foster program is the option of a foster to adopt program. And we actually had 3 of our volunteers end up adopting their foster cat. So this indicates that short-term fostering might be a viable option to improve adoption outcomes and retain the cat in the home, although future research should be done on this topic as well. Another benefit is engagement of shelter staff and the community. It was pretty easy to find people who wanted to be involved and take cats for fostering, and shelter staff and volunteers were very open to the idea of an adult cat foster program and excited to be involved. And then finally, another benefit to applying this to your shelter is it can contribute to life-saving efforts by freeing up space when shelter space is limited. So if it's kitten season and you have no cages open, or there's some emergency that brings all these cats to your shelter all at once, then knowing that you can take cats and place them into foster even for just 24 hours without significant impacts to their welfare is something that's really beneficial and can help increase the shelter's capacity to help more cats. Now, some considerations for establishing these foster programs. First, that foster volunteers should be informed about the potential for the litter box aversion, and that this might be a temporary side effect due to stress or the relocation of the cat. This also might be relevant for people adopting cats and bringing them home the first day as well, that they might expect their cat for there to be a period where they're not urinating because of the stress. It also could be useful to provide a foster program cheat sheet to each new foster with details of what to expect, including that litter box aversion. And it's also really important to provide a contact at the shelter if urination is not seen on the following day. So if the cat has gone all night without going to the litter box, then you should reach out to the shelter just to make sure that there's no health issues, because holding urine for too long can be very dangerous for the cat as well. Now, with that said, you're going to need a person who's responsible for the coordination of the cats and fosters. So you need someone to be that point person if there is an issue with the cat, and also to coordinate pickup and drop off of the cats as well. And then finally, you'll need a system for marking which cats go to foster. You can see here on the right, one of the signs we placed on the cage that indicated this cat was participating in this work or about to go out to foster. That way, people in the shelter knew not to take this cat out for outreach or move the cat to a different cage. So those are all considerations to keep in mind if you are going to establish a program like this at your shelter. But the biggest takeaway here is that short-term foster programs, even just one-night stays, are not problematic for shelter cats. There are not significant reasons to avoid placing cats in foster care for one day or 1 week due to behavioral or stress-related concerns. So if you need to do it, go ahead. I do provide some select references for further reading, and here's my contact. I believe they have my website link that they'll share in the chat as well. And I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Our first question is, I'm wondering if you thought of testing 1 week into the foster when the cats would have settled into their foster home rather than when they were back at the shelter.
Yes, so that would be great for a future study. The reason we didn't do that for this is because we wanted the time points to line up for each group. And for cats that were going to 1 day foster, the day after made the most sense. And so we did the same for the 1 week, the day after they returned. So we did that to keep that consistent with the groups, that it would always be the day following the completion of the intervention. But I agree. I think that future work should look at not only that first day at foster, but the last day of foster, as well as the return to the shelter.
For fosters who took more than one cat, did they take them all at the same time and house them together, or take them one at a time?
They took them one at a time. Yeah. So we didn't want to have that confounding variable of having multiple foster cats. Though I will say we did not restrict people if they had cats in the home or even dogs in the home from allowing those individuals to interact, especially for the 1 week fosters. And we were provided videos of a cat being introduced to a dog, and it was very sweet. The cat goes up to the dog and headbutts him. But that was not typical. Most people just took the cat and they did not have pets at home. So it was just the single cat being taken.
Did the cats that didn't urinate in the box urinate out of the box, or did they just not urinate that day?
So we had both. Because this was not something we were expecting, we did not collect actual data on what happened as far as urination. We just know they didn't go in the box. But I know just from fosters telling me, we had at least one foster where the cat peed on their backpack. So there were some cats where it was just the urination was in a different location, but there did appear to be some cats who just didn't urinate as well until the normal clay litter box was replaced. So it could be that it was also just an aversion to that hydrophobic litter. But again, all those cats use the hydrophobic litter at baseline. So it's not quite sure what's going on there. But yeah, all the data we collected was just whether or not they went in that litter box.
Were all of the adopted cats from the 1 week fosterers?
I would have to go back and check, but off the top of my head, I think that they were. I know at least the 2 were. I can't remember the 3rd, but I believe so. Yeah.
Awesome. Were the litter boxes sent with the foster home the same litter boxes as they had in the shelter kennel? Like, could it be stress? Not
Yeah,
the litter
so
box.
So the when we collected the urine, we used a different litter box. It was just a black plastic litter box that could be disposed. So whenever we collected urine, that was the litter box that we placed the special hydrophobic litter in. But then after we collected the urine, they were given a separate regular litter box with clay litter that could be replaced. And that would have been the same litter box they would have had in the shelter. So hopefully that makes sense. But for urine, we always used a black disposable box. And for just giving them a box to go in after the urine was collected, it was just a normal box with clay litter.
To find your fosters, what method of advertisement did you use? How did you recruit the fosters, especially since these were two new programs?
So one way we did it was through flyers at each shelter, just advertising to volunteers and staff that were already there. And we did get several people that way. We also advertised through Oregon State University. So there's a newsletter that goes out to everyone at OSU where we put seeking volunteers for foster research. And we got quite a few volunteers that way. And then also just word of mouth. People saw the OSU advertisement or they saw the shelter advertisement and told other people. So that was basically the main method of recruiting, was through newsletters and flyers.
Awesome. And I believe Denise is unmuted and she can ask her question now.
Hi, I just had a question. We work at a local cat rescue here in Buffalo, New York. We have a regular foster program that has been running for quite a few years. Our program's been in place for about 22 years. I'm the foster care coordinator along with the volunteer coordination. I was just wondering, I was watching how many cats, like we have over 500 cats in foster care at kitten season. How would you suggest, I'm trying to word it properly, how to get the word out in a local area?
About the opportunity to foster? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get, I've had a year under my belt. I've done a kitten season and we're going into kitten season here. So I need some insight on how you guys do it out your way on the West Coast, how you get ideas to bring in fosters like you just suggested before, and maybe some new insights for kitten season.
Well, I would say that utilizing social media is a big thing. We do it in our other research studies as well. If you have a social media platform, then being able to get out advertisements that way. Craigslist can also be a great way. We've done a lot of recruiting via Craigslist. Basically, just however you can reach people, both online and with paper flyers, because not everyone is on social media. And it might be good to go around to other local shelters and advertise using flyers there as well. As far as preparing for kitten season, I would say that you're going to want to start soliciting for fosters well in advance. You don't want to start getting all the kittens in and then start recruiting foster volunteers. Do it several months ahead so you have people lined up. And I would also suggest having some kind of foster orientation if you're going to have a lot of them. That's not something we did in this program. That would then, help people become acclimated before you're sending out cats, a whole bunch for kitten season. So hopefully that answered your question.
Awesome. And we also have a new MU Maddie's University course on foster recruitment that is self-paced. You said if you need to put a cat in foster for space, go ahead. But should we consider putting cats in foster even for 1 to 2 days to give them a break from the noise and stress of the shelter life?
Yeah, I would say so. Now, again, we did not find significant benefits in terms of stress or social behavior, but that does not mean that there is no benefit as far as having that enrichment and having the experience of that set caretaker with individualized attention, knowing that social isolation is a major stressor. I would say yes. We're not seeing any reason not to do that. And again, if you're trying to send a cat out that has a lot of aggression or fear, maybe that's not the right one because a change in environment might just further exacerbate that or further exaggerate that. But I would say in general that there should be no reason that you can't just send a cat out for 1 to 2 days just to give them a break.
Awesome. One of the sample size, it was 80, correct? Somebody had just asked.
So, so you'll want to look at the paper for more details. I didn't want to get too bogged down because every single test had a different sample size, but we enrolled 80 cats, but that does not mean that the sample size was 80 because, as I mentioned, we had several cats get adopted after they began the program, so they couldn't continue with all the time points. We had cats, unfortunately, with medical issues. One cat had to be euthanized halfway through. And then we also had we enrolled cats who didn't urinate in the litter box at baseline. I think there were 7 or 8 of them. And because we wanted to make sure that urine was constant, so we were, being able to measure that at every time point compared to baseline. So I don't know off the top of my head what each sample size was for each test, but I would urge you to go to the paper and look because it differs. But it is one consideration for the study is we didn't end up with a huge sample size because of these constraints. And it would be very beneficial to do a similar study, but maybe be able to do it across the country or several different sites. Because our length of stay for the cats at the shelters I was working at was just so short, which is great for them. But for us, it just meant cats were leaving and we'd enroll participants and they'd be gone. So it definitely was one constraint of the study was that we didn't end up with as big a sample size as we had wanted.
Someone is asking, were there any factors that were considerations for which cats were placed into which groups, or was it random?
It was random. The only considerations, and this is something we discussed in the paper, were if the shelter told us, no, we're not sending that cat out. Now, that would happen if, say, it was, a Persian or a Siamese cat, something that appeared to be, something people would take very quickly. And so we would be restricted in taking certain cats because the shelter said, that cat's just going to go tomorrow. Don't enroll it. So that did bias our sample toward mixed breed cats. But then again, while that's an important consideration, these are probably also the cats that would be sent out to foster in real life. If we know that a Siamese cat is probably going to be adopted like that, then what's the point of sending them to foster? So I think it still is a pretty accurate representation of what we would have in the real world.
A few minutes ago, you discussed foster education, and someone would just wondered if you could clarify that.
Yeah, so we did not do any kind of foster education in the study, but I think it would be beneficial, especially if you're going to launch a big program where you're trying to send many, many cats out, just to kind of give them an idea of what to expect, that there might be some stress on that first day, that might result in them avoiding the litter box or maybe going outside of the litter box, and also proper cat-human interactions, how to read cat body language, all things that can help those fosters understand maybe when it's time to give that foster cat space versus when it's time to actively engage with them. So I think that could be something that's beneficial, and it could even maybe improve the outcomes of the fostering if the volunteers themselves are more educated about how to play with a cat, how to interact with them, how to read behavior. So yeah, I would suggest something like that might be beneficial.
Makes sense. Isabel says, are most fearful cats bounced from foster to foster because they aren't making significant improvements in the home, and the foster gets impatient? They want to trade for a more social foster cat. Were there any cats in your study who were in multiple groups, who spent 3 different one-day foster homes, or did you see any differences in the results?
No, each cat was in one group or the other, so we didn't have any crossover like that. But that would be a really cool future study. Maybe certain characteristics of the foster, length of foster, anything like that could impact the outcome. So maybe for some cats going to a home with being confined to a room, maybe that works better for them than other cats where having access to the full house is a better outcome. So I do think there's more factors we could look at. with that. But yeah, we didn't do any kind of crossover into the other groups.
Okay. And she had a second question, which is, do you think it's more or less beneficial to move them from foster to foster in order to keep them out of the shelter? Or maybe 1 or 2 foster homes with longer shelter stays in between so they can settle, even if it's a less than ideal environment, and hopefully have that in-person opportunity for someone to fall in love with them?
It's hard for me to say without future research, but knowing that cats do display stress on that first night of foster as measured by that litter box aversion, I would say we would want to keep this switching environment to a minimum. Now, we could find that's not the case at all, in future work. But I would say that if they can be put into a foster and stay for longer rather than switching them around, that's probably more beneficial. But without future work, I can't say for certain.
Christy was asking, were there any depressed, as in like lethargic, nice but not interested in pets, or may have stopped eating cats who went to foster homes?
No, not that I can remember. If there was a significant medical issue, we didn't enroll them just because of the impacts that, they would have to be sent for medical care and they might not be there when we needed them, as well as it could be detrimental for their health to have that additional stress of change in environment. We did have one cat partway through who did become sick and unfortunately had to be euthanized. But at the beginning of the study, she was not acting lethargic or sick or anything. So that was not something that we dealt with.
What training did the foster homes get in the study? They're asking about how were they told to integrate the cats into the home, that type of thing.
So there really was not that much guidance, honestly, which I think could be an improvement for future research. Like I mentioned, providing education to the fosters about how to properly, introduce the cat to this new environment. So we didn't do anything like that. Basically, it was kind of just like instructions on how to collect the data. And we would say, give the cat some time to acclimate, let them come out of the carrier on their own, don't force them to come out. But other than just those general guidelines, there was no sort of formal education for the fosters. And like I mentioned, many of our fosters were people from shelters who had experience with cats and had fostered cats previously, or were a lot of them were students at OSU who had an animal background. So it didn't really seem super necessary to give them a lot of instruction, but I think depending on your source of fosters, that may be more or less important.
Absolutely. Nancy says, I've recently seen comments about it taking 3 days, 3 weeks, and 3 months for dogs to acclimate to new homes. Have there been similar studies for cats since, as you mentioned, even fosters wanted friendlier cats?
I don't know of any research that's looked at that. It's possible it exists, but I haven't heard that. And I don't know off the top of my head if that exists, but it would be very interesting to look at that.
And I would just add in that for dogs, that those recommendations of checking in at those time periods are recommendations that have been made for years and years at this point, but we certainly have research that it takes animals time to adapt, but we don't have research that tells us that these are the perfect and ideal times to check in and for dogs to acclimate either. I wish we did.
Question, did the cats have similar backgrounds? Were they strays, owner surrenders?
Yeah, we did collect that data. I don't know off the top of my head what the proportion of each were, but it included strays who came from an unknown source, owner surrenders, cats who had been returned to the shelter. There were just the typical sources of cats that end up at shelters.
Am I missing anything? I'm not seeing any other questions, but please let me know.
I think that is our last question, unless anybody has any last questions that they want to ask. Thank you, Kristyn, so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Please continue the discussion or ask further questions on Maddie's Pet Forum. Our next Maddie's Insight will be with one of the world's most preeminent animal behaviorists, Dr. Nicholas Dodman and Ian Dunwoody, and they will be speaking about treatment options for canine fears and anxiety. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kristyn.